Sarah had always prided herself on her intuition. At 37, she could usually sense when something wasn't right, a skill that had served her well through a difficult first marriage and now, 2 years into her relationship with Richard. Yet somehow, she had missed all the signs. The house was unusually quiet that Tuesday afternoon. Richard was on his third business trip of the month, this time to Chicago, and Ethan, her 16-year-old Stepson, had rushed off to soccer practice, leaving a tornado of teenage disarray in his wake. Sarah was about to settle in with her laptop when she noticed Ethan's history textbook on the kitchen counter. He had a major exam tomorrow, one he'd been stressing about all week. "Damn it, Ethan," she muttered, grabbing her car keys. This wasn't the first time she'd have to bail him out of his own forgetfulness. Before heading out, Sarah decided to check his room for any other forgotten study materials. The door creaked open to reveal the typical teenage chaos: clothes strewn across the floor, energy drink cans lining the desk, and walls plastered with posters of bands Sarah had never heard of. As she sifted through the mess, the notification sound from Ethan's laptop caught her attention. The screen glowed from beneath the rumpled hoodie. Sarah wouldn't normally look. She and Richard had agreed to respect Ethan's privacy, but something about the name that flashed across the screen made her pause. "Melissa?" Richard's assistant. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the laptop. In the 2 years since marrying Richard, she'd worked hard to establish boundaries with Ethan. Respecting his privacy was central to building trust. But why would Melissa be messaging her teenage stepson? The professional, petite brunette who organized Richard's schedule and brought coffee to their dinner parties had always seemed perfectly pleasant, if somewhat reserved around Sarah. Another notification pinged. Against her better judgment, Sarah moved the hoodie aside. "Miss you already. Your dad doesn't suspect a thing about last weekend. Same hotel next trip." Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she clicked on the message thread, the screen filled with exchanges that made her stomach lurch. She scrolled upward, each message revealing a deeper layer of betrayal. "Deleted those photos from my phone. E almost saw them yesterday. Told S I'm heading to the Denver conference. Booked the usual room. Can't wait to feel your skin against mine again." With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the photo folder. There were dozens of images. Melissa in lingerie, Richard and Melissa in hotel rooms. Intimate moments captured in locations Sarah recognized from Richard's business trips. Some dated back over 8 months. The timestamp on one particular exchange made her blood run cold. "Melissa, does Ethan suspect anything? He was looking at me strangely at dinner. Richard, he found messages on my phone last month. I explained everything. He won't say anything to Sarah. Melissa, are you sure we can trust him? Richard, he's my son. His loyalty is to me." Sarah sank onto Ethan's bed, the textbook forgotten in her lap. The room suddenly felt airless. All those father-son fishing trips, the sudden interest Ethan had taken in accompanying Richard to weekend client meetings, the knowing glances between them that Sarah had interpreted as typical teenage boy complicity. Her stepson, the boy she'd helped with homework, whose soccer games she'd attended when Richard was too busy, who she'd stayed up with all night when he had mono last winter, had been guarding this secret for weeks, possibly months. Memories flashed through her mind with sickening clarity. Richard's recent weight loss, the new cologne, the sudden conference calls that required privacy. The night last month when she'd found Ethan crying in the kitchen at 2 a.m., claiming it was just stress about college applications. The way Richard had me transferring money from their joint account in odd increments. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Landed in Chicago. Hotel Wi-Fi terrible. Call you tomorrow. Love you." She stared at those last 2 words until they blurred through her tears. In the background, Ethan's laptop pinged again with another message from Melissa. Sarah took a deep breath and began to read, mentally cataloging every detail of the affair as evidence of the life she thought she had versus the reality that had been unfolding right under her nose for 48 excruciating hours. Sarah maintained a facade of normalcy. She delivered Ethan's textbook with a smile, prepared his favorite meals, and even managed a brief, cordial phone conversation with Richard. all while her mind raced through every moment of their marriage, re-examining them through the lens of betrayal. When Richard's key turned in the front door Thursday evening, Sarah was waiting in the living room, an untouched glass of wine in her hand. He entered carrying an expensive leather duffel bag, and wearing the confident smile of a man whose life was perfectly in order. "There's my beautiful wife," he announced, placing a small gift bag on the coffee table. "A little something from Michigan Avenue." Sarah stared at the bag. "Michigan Avenue is in Chicago." "That's where I was," Richard replied, his smile faltering slightly as he loosened his tie. "No," Sarah said quietly. "You were at the Lakeside Hotel, room 718, with Melissa." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face cycled through shock, denial, and finally, a resigned recognition. "How did you?" "Ethan's laptop," Sarah interrupted. "You made your 16-year-old son complicit in your affair, Richard. What kind of father does that?" Richard sank into that armchair across from her. "It's complicated, Sarah." "Complicated?" she echoed, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "Let me uncomplicate it for you. While showing me Instagram photos of your networking dinners, you were actually sending Melissa lingerie pictures with captions about how she looks better in black lace than your wife does." Richard paled. "You read all of it?" "Enough," Sarah said. "More than enough." Just then, the front door opened again. Ethan stepped into the tension-filled room, his soccer bag slung over one shoulder. His eyes darted between Sarah and his father, immediately registering that something was terribly wrong. "Ethan," Richard started, his voice strained. "Sarah knows about how you've been lying to me." Sarah finished for him, maintaining her composure for Ethan's sake. "About how you've put your son in an impossible position." Ethan dropped his bag, his young face crumpling with guilt and relief. "I wanted to tell you," he blurted out. "Dad said it would just be worse for everyone if—" "This isn't on you," Sarah assured him, crossing the room to place her hands on his shoulders. "None of this is your fault." As Ethan broke down in her arms, Richard watched from across the room, the architect of his own family's unraveling. By Saturday morning, Richard had moved into a hotel, leaving behind a house filled with emotional shrapnel. Sarah had barely slept, alternating between fury and grief. She was packing some of Richard's clothes into a suitcase when she found it, a small velvet box tucked inside his winter coat pocket. Inside wasn't jewelry but a USB drive. Curiosity overrode her better judgment. The drive contained financial records, offshore accounts, suspicious transfers, and emails between Richard and several names Sarah didn't recognize. This wasn't just about infidelity. Richard was involved in something potentially illegal. The doorbell interrupted her discovery. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with Melissa. "I know you hate me," the younger woman said without preamble. "You have every right to. But there's something you need to know." Melissa's revelation was shocking. She wasn't just Richard's lover, but had been secretly gathering evidence of his financial misconduct at the request of the FBI. The affair had started genuinely, but had evolved into something else entirely when she discovered discrepancies in the company accounts. "They're closing in on him," Melissa explained, her composed exterior cracking. "I never meant to hurt you or Ethan. But Richard isn't who you think he is." As if on cue, Sarah's phone lit up with a news alert. Richard's company was under federal investigation for wire fraud and tax evasion. When Ethan returned from his friend's house that afternoon, Sarah faced an impossible decision: shield him from this new layer of betrayal, or prepare him for the storm that was coming. "There's something we need to talk about," she said as Ethan dropped onto the couch beside her, his eyes red-rimmed from days of emotional turmoil. "Is it about Dad and Melissa?" he asked. "It's about your dad," Sarah replied carefully. "But it's bigger than the affair." The following weeks unfolded like a fever dream. Federal agents interviewed Sarah and Ethan. Richard's assets were frozen. Former business associates emerged with damning testimonies. And through it all, Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of protecting Ethan from the full brunt of his father's disgrace. "Why are you still helping me with college applications?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by brochures and essay drafts. "You're divorcing my dad. You don't have to do any of this." Sarah looked up from the scholarship form she was reviewing. "I'm not divorcing you, Ethan." The boy's eyes welled with tears. "But he lied to both of us. He used me to cover for him. And now all this other stuff." His voice trailed off. "Your father's choices don't define you," Sarah said firmly, "and they don't erase the fact that for 2 years, I've been your stepmom. That means something to me." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find Richard's mother, Eleanor, a formidable woman in her 70s, who had never fully embraced Sarah. "I suppose you're enjoying all this," Eleanor said icily, stepping into the house uninvited. "My son's reputation in tatters while you play the round wife." Before Sarah could respond, Ethan appeared behind her. "Don't talk to her like that, Grandma," he said, his voice stronger than Sarah had heard in weeks. "She's the only one who hasn't lied to me." Eleanor's expression softened slightly at her grandson's defiance. "Richard told me this was all a misunderstanding." "Did you also explain the offshore accounts?" Sarah asked quietly. "Or why federal agents have seized his computer?" For the first time, doubt flickered across Eleanor's face. "I need to speak with my son." After she left, Ethan turned to Sarah with a wry smile. "Family dinner's going to be awkward this Thanksgiving." It was the first time either of them had laughed in weeks. 6 months later, Sarah sat in a crowded courtroom, watching as Richard was sentenced to 7 years for financial crimes. The affair that had once seemed like the ultimate betrayal now appeared almost trivial compared to the elaborate fraud he had perpetrated. As people filed out of the courtroom, Melissa approached Sarah cautiously. "I never got to properly apologize," she said. "Not just for the affair, but for all of it." Sarah studied the woman who had once been her nemesis. "You were doing your job." "Not the part where I got involved with him," Melissa admitted. "That was a mistake that hurt innocent people, especially Ethan." Speaking of Ethan, Sarah thought as she spotted him waiting by the courthouse steps, looking older in his suit and tie. At 17, he carried himself with a new maturity forged through public scandal and private grief. "How did it go?" he asked when she reached him. 7 years, Sarah replied, with possibility of parole in 5. Ethan nodded, processing this information with remarkable composure. "Are you still moving forward with selling the house?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. They fell into step together, heading toward the parking lot. "But I signed a lease on that apartment near your first-choice college. 2 bedrooms. Ethan stopped walking. "You're serious about moving there, even if I'm in the dorms?" "I promised I'd help you through college," Sarah reminded him. "That hasn't changed." "But you're not legally responsible for me anymore," he pointed out. "The divorce was finalized months ago." Sarah smiled. "Some promises exist outside of legal documents, Ethan." That evening, as they packed boxes in the house that had briefly been a home to their blended family, Sarah found an old photo taken at her wedding to Richard. She'd had almost thrown it away when Ethan noticed. "Keep it," he suggested. "Not because of him, but because that's the day you became my stepmom." Sarah placed the photo in a box labeled New Apartment. 2 years ago, she'd had walked into a marriage expecting one kind of life. 8 months ago, she had walked into her stepson's room and discovered a truth that had shattered that illusion. But today, she was walking forward, not alone, as she had feared, but with an unexpected ally, who had become the silver lining in the dark cloud of betrayal. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as she sealed the box, the family you choose proves stronger than the family you marry into. And sometimes, the most devastating discoveries lead to the most authentic connectee.